Right, I am introducing myself. I am Charles Kenny. Thank you very much for coming. And well, this is what we will be talking about today. I'm hoping to leave lots of time for discussion. At the Baku climate conference last year, participants agreed to raise the global target for international climate finance from 100 billion, which had been set at Paris, to 300 billion a year by 2035. A lot of people thought that number was insultingly low, and it is true that it is very small compared to estimates of the financing needed if we're to keep the world on track to 1.5 degrees. The Songwei-Stern Commission suggests we'd need about $2 trillion a year in finance for developing countries. That's excluding China. And 1 trillion out of that 2 trillion would have to come from international finance each year. And that is only one part of the money we would need to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals. At the same time, I think we were never going to get to the trillions. And in part, that's because the scenarios for delivery sort of unrealistically assumed the private sector would provide an immense amount of the cash. But we'll get to that in a little bit. But I have to say, I think a more immediate problem is that real financing for development and climate adaptation is actually falling, not rising. And one reason is that mitigation financing, climate mitigation financing, is eating up development finance, even as it remains pretty much ineffective at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what I want to discuss first. Donor negotiators did not come home from Baku and work with congresses and parliaments to triple the financing they provided to developing countries. In fact, the last year has seen aid budgets slashed, perhaps most notably in the US, but with the UK and others not far behind. If the proposed budget, administration proposed budget in the US is actually followed through on, I hope it's not, US assistance as a proportion of GNI would drop by 0.1% between 2020 and 27. Same number for the UK is 0.4%. Robin Davis has made a global prediction suggesting that if you look at all donors together, global ODA in 2027 may be a third below peak. The sort of better news out of that is that's still more than ODA was 8 years earlier, before the rise driven by the war in Ukraine. The bad news is that the cuts are already affecting some of the most effective assistance and life-saving assistance included. With my colleague Justin Sandifer, we've estimated just the cuts that occurred in USAID in the first few months of this year, which is not by any means all of the cuts in the US. Just those cuts are likely to be associated with 500,000 additional deaths each year, primarily due to more deaths from HIV. The worst news, if there can be worse news, is that exacerbated by the triple climate finance deal, there could be even more catastrophic times ahead for life-saving development assistance. Not all climate finance draws on overseas development assistance, but a lot does. ODA also includes a lot of stuff that can't count as climate finance, and I think, frankly, shouldn't count as ODA. Things including aid administration costs, most debt relief, and in-donor costs of housing refugees. The country programmable measure of ODA helpfully excludes those categories, CPA. Using a low-end estimate for 2022, about $46 billion in total climate finance was supported by ODA, a little more than half of total reported climate finance in that year. That compares to about 125 billion in total country programmable aid. As a back-of-the-envelope calculation, then, more than a third of ODA that is actually involving investment in developing countries, CPA, is already going to climate finance. Well, multiply up the need for climate finance from 100 billion to 300 billion a year and keep the proportion that comes from ODA the same, the result is fairly obvious. It eats up more than all country programmable aid. In other words, there will be nothing left to finance investments in developing countries from outside ODA for anything other than climate-related activities. And meanwhile, for all it should have done, the climate emergency has not incentivized greater international financial generosity from richer countries. Earlier talk in the climate community, correct talk in the climate community, that climate finance should be new and additional, has been largely abandoned. Studies from CGD and elsewhere have shown that climate finance is diverting rather than significantly adding to ODA. As a share of all donor economies, total overseas development assistance fell from 0.35% in 2009, when the 100 billion target was set, to 0.33% in 2024, and we can see that it's going to drop further in the years to come. Meanwhile, ODA to the poorest countries was 31 billion in 2011. It was 32 billion in 2023. That is a per capita decrease. It's a declining share of total aid flows and is deeply disappointing. And that declining low-income share, these are the countries living on a GNI per capita of about $1,000 or less a year. They are very poor countries. That declining share reflects the fact that there is a real trade-off between climate mitigation, reducing emissions, and finance for broader development, as well as support for adaptation. Development finance is best spent in the poorest countries, where it will have the biggest impact on the quality of life. $1 of assistance just makes a lot more difference in a country like Burundi, with a per capita Atlas GNI of $220, than it does in a developing country like China, with a per capita GNI of $13,000. ODA works in those poorest countries to improve outcomes. It works to improve growth as well. A 1 percentage point increase in the aid to GNI ratio is associated with an annual growth increase of about 1/3 of a percentage point in GNI. That spending is also a really good use of adaptation finance, climate adaptation finance. Development is a resilience strategy. If you look at the number of people who die in natural disasters, it's very high in poor countries. It's much lower in richer countries, for example. And a lot of the poorest countries are strung across the tropics and highly reliant on rain-fed agriculture. They are the ones in most urgent need of adaptation support. They are already seeing declining yields from climate change. But those same low-income countries are currently responsible for 0.5% of global emissions, and they're not going to be responsible for much more in 20 years to come. I'm going to compare the world's biggest emitter, China, compare Brazil and India, which are already large parts of the global climate problem. They're richer countries. Low-income countries are also the countries where the subsidy costs for introducing zero-carbon approaches are high. If you want to get the biggest bang for your buck from $1 of mitigation spending, you want to spend it where you can get the most mitigation for that dollar. It isn't in low-income countries. It's going to be in big, much richer developing countries. So good mitigation finance looks very different from good adaptation and development finance. Where the best adaptation and development finance will be used in the poorest countries, the best mitigation finance should be used in much richer countries. Adding to the problem from a donor perspective is the fact that cheap climate finance looks very different from effective development finance. Donors can count a portion of profit-making lending to richer developing countries as ODA, along with the total lent value as climate change. So they have a strong incentive to move from costly grants for development work in the poorest countries to support revenue-raising loans for mitigation in richer developing countries. Under the circumstances, it should not be a surprise that when you look at international climate finance, nearly all of it's going to mitigation. Sorry, there's billions, not percentages. So 84 billion to mitigation, 32 billion to adaptation. And it should not be a surprise that very little climate finance is going to low-income countries. It is perhaps worth pointing out at this moment what ODA recipients actually think that international finance should be spent on. They want to focus on education and infrastructure and growth, not climate. Between 2020 and 2021, the World Bank surveyed 43 different of its client countries. Representatives from government and aid agencies and media and academia and the private sector and civil society. On average, less than 6% of respondents listed climate as one of their country's top 3 development priorities. When it comes to which sectors respondents believe the World Bank should dedicate their resources to, climate reached the top 10 of sectors in only 7 out of 43 countries, none of which were amongst the poorest World Bank clients. It might also be worth thinking through what a climate justice approach suggests. Using the Stern discounting rule, a dollar spent on mitigation rather than consumption has a bigger negative impact on the quality of life in low income than rich countries. Furthermore, again, these are the countries already suffering the most from the impact of climate change, something they didn't cause. They have the absolute right to prioritize development over mitigation, and I think they have the absolute right to expect outside support to help them do that. I think this is especially the case because mitigation finance isn't working. Analysis looking at the relationship between past ODA climate finance for mitigation and subsequent emissions finds that a positive relationship, which is to say, more climate finance for mitigation, more emissions. This is not what you would hope to see. Look at mitigation ODA between 2000 and 2020. Worldwide, it totals $185 billion. The chart uses cumulative climate ODA over that period here and compares it to emissions intensity, so the number of kilograms of CO2 per dollar of GDP, the change between 2000 and 2020. There's no significant relationship you can see in that graph if you run a regression analysis. Again, it suggests the relationship is usually positive. More mitigation finance, more carbon intensity. Now, for 35 of these countries, the cumulative total of mitigation ODA as a proportion of GNI over 20 years is more than 5% of GNI. That's a lot of money. For comparison, the US Inflation Reduction Act added up to about 1.6% of US GDP. So 5% is 3 times that. And yet, despite this really considerable spending, we're seeing no relationship. The case of this is Kiribati. Between 2000 and 2019, Kiribati received 28% of its GNI in mitigation finance, in grants to do mitigation. Meanwhile, it saw its annual carbon emissions rise from 36 to 57,000 tons. Now, it didn't work for mitigation. Some of the climate spending was meant to be dual purpose, not just about mitigation, but also about helping Kiribati adapt. I hope it did a better job at that. As you can tell, this is a small island state. It really needs adaptation financing. So hopefully, even if it didn't help mitigation, it did help with adaptation. But it certainly didn't help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. Mitigation finance is kind of what we got when we couldn't agree on a global carbon market or a global carbon tax. And it doesn't appear to be a very effective substitute. And that is in part because of who gets to decide what counts as climate finance. that would be pretty much the same OECD countries who get to decide that spending money on hotels in Brighton to house asylum seekers counts as overseas development assistance. Having agreed to 100 billion in finance and more recently 300 billion in finance, these countries have every incentive to be generous as to what's included in that total. That flexibility covers the kind of finance. Is it grants? Is it loans? Is it mobilized private finance? And what it supports. You may recognize Geert here, Geert van Rampelberg, the Belgian heartthrob, star of the movie La Tierra Roja, set in the forests of Argentina. The film itself was supported by some of Belgium's contribution to the 100 billion climate finance goal. Things that have been branded as climate finance for mitigation alongside motion pictures include investments in gelato stores, doing municipal transparency in Gaza, and teaching reform at higher education institutions. Perhaps unsurprisingly, donors don't appear to be particularly keen to measure the efficacy of their mitigation spending, but in the few cases where we do actually have evidence, and that includes the portfolio of the World Bank Clean Technology Fund and the Green Climate Fund, what we learn is that their projects, some are reducing emissions at reported costs of just $10 per tonne, which is pretty good. A lot of others are $1,000 per tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent averted, suggesting a lot of really rather inefficient projects. And that's the ones we're measuring, most we're not. The Potemkin features of climate finance, I think, meet their most rococo nature when it comes to mobilized private finance, where donor action supposedly incentivizes private investment in developing country climate projects. For the funds to count as mobilized climate finance towards the goal, according to the OECD, the general assumption is that the private sector would not have invested in a given company in a developing country without the official sector involvement. That implies mobilization is taken as a given. Theoretically, I could lend $1 on behalf of the UK government to a $5 billion solar project in China, claim the assumption that it was my dollar that made all the difference to that project going ahead, and there's $5 billion in climate finance for the UK. Now, to be fair to donors, I don't actually think they are that brazen at all, but it does bring us to this often heralded solution to the massive global investment needs, absent any donor desire to provide more money, the green fairy godmother, the magic pony, that is private finance. As the climate finance ask gets bigger, the amount donors plan to rely on the private sector to deliver it increases even faster. If you look at the teetering Just Energy Transition Partnership Agreement with Indonesia, between donors and Indonesia, teetering because the current government isn't such a fan, it's designed to speed the path to low carbon development in that country. It proposes that donors somehow are going to leverage $10 billion from the private sector, using about $2 billion in guarantees and market rate loans from donors, and $300 million in grants. It's a very good deal for the donors. Parts of the private sector are very happy to play along with this charade. That should come as no surprise because it is, or at least could potentially involve huge handouts from the government to the private sector. BlackRock, which is a US-based investment manager, has proposed a $100 billion annual grant mechanism to de-risk private climate investments in developing countries through greater public exposure to loss. As we've seen, that $100 billion would more than eat up all the VODA for investment worldwide. And it isn't at all clear what we would get in returns of either mitigation or sustainable development. We do know that BlackRock would do rather well out of it. As a result, it is a bit hard to tell what kind of magic pony BlackRock is. I fear probably that it's the third kind of magic pony, the inadequately enchanted donkey. Currently, only about 13% of infrastructure financing is provided by the private sector in low and middle income countries. that blue bit. The rest comes from development finance, ODA and its ilk, and the public sector of developing countries. Meanwhile, institutional investors like BlackRock were contributed to 0.67% of this total in the last decade. In order to meet the investment needs laid out in global stock-taking exercises, we'd need, outside of China, in electricity projects, about 680 billion a year, and for transport, $450 billion a year. It is worth comparing that to annual public-private infrastructure projects worth below 7% of that in both sectors at the moment. Over time, electricity has been the most successful sector in terms of public-private infrastructure projects. And it's true actually in solar and wind. You see that the most sponsored projects are actually private sector projects being sponsored, but they are mostly small scale and considerably subsidized. That's because the rates of return demanded by private providers and financiers, especially in the poorest countries, make private power projects very expensive. This chart just orders a number of developing countries by their credit rating, from good, AAA, to really not good, CCC+, and the associated estimated cost of debt for a private sector solar project. So from 1 or 2% interest rates shooting up towards 25% at the other end. It suggests that in a country like Tanzania, you'd be paying 24% about for debt for solar power, for example, for a solar power project, for example. Host countries try to reduce these costs through agreements, including purchase guarantees that they will buy the power, whether they use it or not, price commitments, providing their own financing and subsidies. But all of this adds to the cost of the project for the economy. And a recent World Bank project that was designed to demonstrate that solar power projects in low-income developing countries didn't need subsidy. Instead, I think demonstrated that it took about $2 in subsidized finance for each $1 in private finance to get these projects off the ground. And that's why even in infrastructure investments sponsored by the private sector, more than half of the actual finance is provided by development finance and the public sector. This is in developing countries. Again, the private sector only accounts for about 1/4 of the finance in the orange bit, 1/4 of the finance in climate projects involving blended public and private money. With below market finance, including ODA, in light blue and other concessional in slightly darker blue, accounting for about 1/3, so more than the private share. This is, again, a particularly acute problem in the poorest countries, where it is taking $1 of public finance to mobilize 37 cents of private finance. That will all help to explain why, despite low-income countries being home to about 1/10 of the developing country population, they get about 1.5% of the public-private infrastructure deals by value. That adds up to about $1 a year. None of this is for lack of trying by donors. By 2012, there were already 67 facilities funding private infrastructure project preparation in Africa alone. More were founded after 2012, including many on this figure, providing project preparation and transaction support, equity, credit enhancements, secured loans, refinancing, secondary transactions, subsidies, guarantees, and more. Private Infrastructure Development Group, financed by DFID, for example, committed about $4 billion in preparation and financing projects between 2002 and 2019. In addition, just between 2018 and 2022, donors provided nearly 18 billion in ODA to private sector instruments, capital increases to bilateral development finance institutions to support the private sector investment in low and middle income countries. And subsidy mechanisms have been introduced, including the IDA private sector window, which takes money out of the World Bank Group's IDA, which largely lends at very subsidized rates to the public sector, takes some of that money, hands it over to the World Bank Group's private sector arm, the IFC, which uses it to subsidize its deals in the poorest countries. All of that kind of sums to about $5 billion a year of ODA going to development finance institutions for subsidies of one sort or another. But the model isn't working. IFC uses subsidies when it looks at deals and says, well, we can't support this on market terms. Private financiers look at those same deals and go, yeah, you're right. And they're not getting the subsidy. So they stay away. This is why private finance, mostly the sponsor investment, accounts for only about a third of project finance in subsidized deals, with the rest provided by governments. IFC subsidized projects mobilize a lot less than its non-subsidized projects do. And since all of its subsidies were introduced, the IFC is working less in low-income countries. This is the total volume of IFC investments in millions in low-income countries over time. You can see a downward trend. In 2024, particularly grim year, about 0.5% of what the corporation was doing, it only works in developing countries, about 0.5% of what it was doing was in low-income countries. European development finance institutions do a bit better, but they're still sort of at the 10% mark. Beyond high prices and extensive guarantees and subsidies, the private sector deals being done often sacrifice a lot to get over the line to completion. So the World Bank, for example, has very clear regulations saying we aren't going to support from the public sector side a private participation in infrastructure deal that isn't issued competitively. I want to make sure that the public sector is getting the best deal it can. The IFC, meanwhile, the private sector arm, is busy investing all over the place in energy projects that were not awarded competitively, and it's using subsidies to support those deals. Most of the big deals that the IFC has been involved with in energy have, over the last 10 years or so, have been non-competitive. And when you add in the need for the high prices and the financing and the subsidies and the guarantees, it's not surprising maybe that private electricity projects have a fairly mixed record. Indeed, they can bankrupt the national distributors. You have to buy their power. If you look at Kenya, for example, private power producers produce 25% of Kenya's power, but they account for 47% of the distributor's power purchase costs, almost twice as much. In Ghana, by 2022, arrears to private power producers producing power that Ghana wasn't using largely were worth 2.3% of GDP, and had the Ghana running to the IMF. Something similar happened in Pakistan. It isn't surprising, then, perhaps, that broader development outcomes are also a bit disappointing. There is no significant link between IFC or DFI involvement more broadly in the energy sector of a country and more people having access to power or more power output in total. Nor, frankly, is there a relationship between the overall level of private sector investment in a power sector and outcomes like the number of people who have access to power or the amount of power they have access to. Finally, for this part, I promise, the capital investments and the subsidies and the project preparation facilities and the guarantees and all the rest of it, the using up all of the scarce overseas development assistance have been associated with declining private financial flows to infrastructure. We hit a peak at about 2012 at about $157 billion worth of PPI deals across the developing world. In 2023, we were down to about half that level. So even after 2 decades of donor efforts to raise billions and billions and into the trillions in private sector investment in developing country infrastructure, for example. The record is one of low leverage and high cost and limited development impact and small and declining scale. The magic pony of the private sector simply isn't coming to the rescue when it comes to climate, and even less so when it comes to the development of the poorest countries. To repeat, the poorest countries are utterly marginal in the fight for lower global emissions, while they are on the front line when it comes to the impact of climate change. They are also where ODA can make a plausible and significant difference to development and well-being, including through adaptation. Available global concessional finance has to be concentrated in these countries, not diverted to much richer governments and firms in far wealthier parts of the world. Climate mitigation and development finance in middle-income countries, where we really need mitigation finance, can be sponsored using close-to-market rate finance. Regarding mitigation, as I say, that is a battle that will be won and lost in far wealthier countries. That's for sort of two reasons. It's where the bulk of the emissions are, but it's also where the bulk of the research effort is into zero carbon solutions. If you look at a cost curve of global low carbon technologies, at one end you have technologies that are already better than free. Replacing light bulbs with old light bulbs with LEDs saves you a lot of money, right? Here the challenge isn't about, challenge to adoption isn't about money, it's about other things, politics, so on and so forth. As you go up, you get more expensive solutions, ones that really, you wouldn't do without some sort of subsidy or pressure to do, including, at the moment at least, nuclear power, for example, in place of cheaper energy sources. At the far right, you get things like gas, carbon capture and storage, which is really quite expensive. There are two basic ways to ease the challenge of meeting our abatement targets. The first is to lower the cost curve through technology advance, the more efficient solar cell or the improved battery. The second is to lower the cost of investment in these technologies through cheaper finance. On the technology side, on the sort of lowering the cost curve side, China, the US, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and Germany, between them, count for 9 out of 10 patents in the world each year, patent applications in the world each year. That is where global research is concentrated. In these countries, further research and development and scaling of low and zero carbon technologies just should be the priority with global benefit. And we know it can happen because, as you all know, the price of solar panels and batteries over the past 3 decades has gone down by about 97%. The more the cost of zero carbon approaches decline, the less you need subsidies or external finance to support their rollout in poorer countries. But I think in middle-income countries in particular, large emitting middle-income countries, there is a considerable role for lowering the cost of finance. To put it another way, we should make the cost of finance for low carbon technologies the same in middle-income countries as it is in high-income countries. Like, that looks like it's going up. It means the cost of finance is going down. Confusing picture. But anyway, you want as I say, the cost to be the same for middle-income countries as it is for high-income countries. The question is, how do you do that in a way that is scalable and affordable? And the primary answer, I think, is low-cost public debt. Lending to middle-income country governments at the rates that high-income country governments borrow themselves. And that is the basic model of multilateral development banking. And it is why, as a rule, multilateral bank loans are usually notably cheaper than market rates for most of their client countries. This orange line crosses at the cost that Ghana, the interest rate that Ghana would have to pay for a World Bank IBRD loan, and a 20-year borrowing rate of 5.75%. Ghana's cost of private debt for the solar project here is 23%, so that's quite a large difference. For Morocco, the gap is 6% borrowing from the IBRD compared to 13% from market. For India, it's 6% and 11%. Multilateral banks like the World Bank could sustain an additional $350 billion a year in mitigation-related lending in perpetuity, with about $50 billion a year over the next 20 years in additional capital. About $30 billion of that $50 billion currently would count as ODA eligible. That would help, if you will, flood the zone for climate mitigation finance in middle-income countries in particular. I think, of course, that 30 billion that comes from ODA should be new and additional, but that's, at least it's only 30 billion, not all of it. The public finance approach not only better matches where we need the resources for climate response, which is largely in the public sector, not in the private sector, but it's also more affordable and scalable and efficient than bespoke private sector approaches we've been trying to date. I think it's also by far the best way to demonstrably meet a $300 billion climate financing commitment. That leaves development financing institutions, the ones that work with the private sector, like the IFC, as second fiddle. I think they are players, they're just not stars. They could still do more. They could work with national development banks to help roll out private sector components of nationally determined contributions to the international climate effort. They could move into large-scale operations in support of more subnational borrowing to states and cities to help them with their climate plans. Perhaps most importantly, rather than being a drain on grant resources, a drain on ODA like they are at the moment, they could focus on more profitable investments in richer countries in order to become a revenue source for ODA. So we could go from a situation where, as I mentioned, about $5 billion a year is going to these private sector investments in DFIs. We could, if they started making a profit by working only in upper middle income countries, they could maybe generate a profit of about $4 billion a year. So from net -5 to +4, $9 billion a year. Compare that to current ODA to low income countries of 22 billion. It's not insignificant. There are quality concerns to address here with ODA and with lending and with DFI investments. Only 1/3 of current ODA is actually implemented by recipient institutions at the moment, for example. Even financing that reaches those institutions is larded with restrictions. One restriction that I think should go away is actually around the use of gas in low-income countries. Gas power generation will help cut the 4 million annual death toll from indoor air pollution in those countries. And again, in low-income countries in particular, it will add pretty much a rounding error to global carbon emissions. In middle-income countries, who we're asking to borrow money for mitigation, we need to make that lending more attractive. And that means less World Bank bureaucracy, it means less multilateral development bank bureaucracy. For development finance institutions, I think I would like to see them do more in climate. I would also like to see them follow the rules that their public sector arms follow around competition and transparency. Regarding the $300 billion goal, the official definition, as I said, is decided by the OECD Club of Rich Countries. That seems very odd to me. It should be something that at least involves recipient countries having a collective voice in what counts and what doesn't too. I'd imagine one such rule could be that for it to count as mitigation finance, it has to be part of nationally determined contributions to the UNFCCC process. I'd also argue that mitigation finance shouldn't count as ODA, and that is because ODA according to the official definition, has the promotion of economic development and welfare of developing countries as the main objective. I think mitigation is about a global public good, not about the welfare of developing countries in particular. I will probably lose that fight. It is important to note at this point that the rich world could easily afford both more generous support for the poorest countries and more expansive support to mitigation projects in middle-income countries. Instead, at the moment, the rich world is taking the decision to skimp on both, I think at immense short-term cost to the poorest in the world and immense long-term cost to all of us. But in this situation, where rich countries are balking on their responsibility, the world's poorest countries would be much better off with development financing continuing near its current level and a little more climate change in 2100 than they would be with no development finance today and a little less climate change in 2100. And the worse you think the impact of climate change is going to be, the more that statement is true. The worse it is to take away aid from the poorest countries that most need the support for adaptation. And furthermore, while climate is an urgent priority, it is also urgent that 16,000 children under the age of 15 will die tomorrow, largely because of easily preventable conditions, and 16,000 more the next day, and 16,000 more the day after that. We cannot solve climate by doing less about extreme poverty. But that's what the current system is pushing us towards. And that, I think, is what is the most immediate crisis of climate and development finance. The fix isn't to hope that the international private sector will suddenly come and provide cheap direct financing at scale for development and climate projects in small, poor economies. Decades of experience have told us that's not going to happen. Instead, we should ring-fence grant resources for urgent development and adaptation needs of the poorest countries, use the considerable leverage of multilateral development banks to support public financing at scale for mitigation and development finance in middle-income countries. Thank you. I think we have some time for questions or comments or disgust or any of the above.
All right, once you're asking a question, please speak into the mic. We'd really appreciate that.
Hello, I'm Jonas, a student in the Masters of Public Policy. My question, you mentioned like a categorization, like adaptation and development finance for lower income countries should be a priority, and mitigation, you stress that middle income countries may be the most bang for a buck, right? If you could explore a bit more, because to me, that's not super intuitive. For instance, in a lot of low-income countries, we still have energy generation with coal, the most dirtiest sources. Isn't it kind of the same, important to also invest in mitigation in low-income countries? Why middle-income countries are better bang for the buck?
Because of when it comes to energy in particular, because of the different nature of fossil and renewable resources and the financing involved. Solar, for example, has a very high upfront cost and actually very low running costs. You don't need to buy the sun. Coal and gas have lower upfront costs. Building the power plant is less of the overall cost, but you have to buy coal and gas over time. If you are borrowing to build the power plant, a solar plant you have to borrow more for because all of the costs are upfront. You have to borrow relatively less for coal and gas. Borrowing costs are higher in low-income countries. So for the same same amount of financial support of whatever sort, you get more mitigation if you are putting it in a place that has lower borrowing costs. Sorry, I did not explain that, and it's, as you can tell, it's not straightforward because I just explained it badly, but I hope you get the point. That would have been the clearer way of putting it, yes.
Hi, thank you so much for the interesting talk. I'm a second-year DPhil student in biology. I study international public biodiversity finance. So kind of like very similar to what you're doing, but for the biodiversity side. And we also have a similar target, although much smaller for very irrational reason, I would say. But we also have a 30 billion by 2030 target for international public finance, or people call it biodiversity related development finance. OECD seems to keep making up new terms. But my question is mainly about the interpretation of the new and additional clause in all Rio conventions, not just climate. So I theoretically agree with your point on how mitigation finance should not be counted technically as development finance, but GPG finance, global public good, is sometimes very difficult to like isolate like perfectly from like finance that is specifically for economic development. Especially when we look at biodiversity finance, we have a lot of community-based programs which have both conservation and kind of community empowerment and economic development motive at the same time, almost at the same level. So in that case, how should we account for that? And another question is, you also mentioned a couple times about how the OECD member countries, I guess you specifically mean the Development Assistance Committee members, who decide all the rules for CRS and reporting and monitoring. But then what is the alternative? Do you have a faith in TOSTI maybe because they involve more recipients? Or do we have a dedicated monitoring system under the framework? Or can GCF, GEF, website, web-based disclosure system? What is the alternative then?
Those are both really good points. First off, yeah, it is hard. So a lot of power projects count as mitigation, but obviously they're also development. I can imagine the problem is even more complicated with biodiversity. To some extent, is this right to say that either you really need to define mitigation or you really need to define new and additional? If you do either, it's probably okay. We've done neither. And so maybe what I should be asking for, I mean, actually, kind of what I am asking for is, look, just throw a whole bunch of money at multilateral development banks. Say it's just for mitigation in climate mitigation. Make sure it's going to add up to more than 300 billion, and you're done. And I'll kind of leave you alone. I would like that either not to count as ODA or to be additional to existing ODA flows. But basically I take your point that it is actually really hard to separate this stuff out. It's not just about it's convenient not to define it. It is also that it is hard to define. So I take your point, but that sort of comes to your second point. I think it was a real mistake for developing countries to focus on a target number without worrying very much about the definition of that number, and sort of going, yeah, we'll accept whatever the OECD says. It's a bit too late now because we've agreed on the target number. But in my perfect world, at some point between Paris and last year, there would have been set up a body that was, I guess, part of the UNFCCC process to say this is what we are counting as climate finance. And we are coming up with a definition of climate finance, not the OECD, us. And then once you've got that definition, agree on the number. Yeah, okay. My perfect world is up in smoke. We have 300 billion now. Where do we go from there? I still think they ought to try and define the negotiations over definition are going to be a lot tougher now because you're defining something that has to add up to 300 billion. But I still think it's worth the effort. And also, it seems to me like not a big reach to say, look, this money ought to go to something that's in nationally determined contribution. You know, that is part of what these countries say they are going to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as part of this international process. You know, the finance has to go towards that. That seems to me a fairly low bar. But yeah, your point taken, and I'm probably being naive.
Thanks so much. Hi, I'm Bethan. I'm a research assistant at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. Yeah, I was just wondering, I guess maybe quite speculative thoughts as we approach the 2030 target year for the Sustainable Development Goals. What your thoughts are on kind of whether what comes next has the potential to kind of I guess advocate for like a more holistic approach, like avoiding separating like climate and development and mitigation and biodiversity, those financing needs that tackle kind of a lot of those challenges together. Or yeah, I guess just interested in about what forums you think this shift in the narrative might occur, if not through the Sustainable Development Goals.
That's tough. I think the Millennium Development Goals were quite successful in their way at focusing in on a few things that actually about $50 billion worth of aid could do. And the SDGs haven't been so good at that and haven't really found themselves another purpose. I still think they're a really good thing. I actually do think it says something good about the planet that, you know, the world could come together and agree all of this stuff was good. I mean, they didn't agree about how to get there, but you know, that the world accepts that we should be trying to reduce poverty. And I mean, it may sound like nothing, but I do think it's something having a kind of vision for a better planet. Even as I say, even without a plan on how to get there. And so I don't want to be too down on the SDGs, but I don't think they were particularly useful from the point of view of directing or shaping finance, or indeed policy change in almost any other area. And so I guess what I would like to see is a process continuing that basically says, look, we the world agree all of these things should happen and are good things. And then maybe actually sort of divorcing that. So, you know, rather than trying to come up with financing plans for the SDGs that, you know, were never going to be met, coming up with financing plans for something that we could plausibly meet, even though, you know, it won't look as good as the SDGs. And I wish we were in an SDG achieving world. That doesn't really answer your question, though, because I don't think I have one. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for the very informative talk. My name is Camilla. I'm part of the Oxford Martin School, and I work on macroeconomics here. My question is, what are your thoughts on how to delink indebtedness and the ability to mobilize climate finance, and how can more be done to show the evidence of adaptation in terms of promoting development by reducing some of the costs that would have been incurred had a climate incident happen that would have had a bigger detrimental impact on development had that finance not been available.
Yeah. So IBRD financing is a lot, World Bank market-ish rate financing is a lot cheaper than a lot of the financing that's currently causing debt distress. And I understand why the World Bank's board, amongst others, is worried about lending to countries that the last XD years have only had access to IDA, have only had access to the really very, very concessional lending out of the World Bank. And similarly across the other MDBs. I understand why they're worried about coming in with IBRD loans to those countries, but actually I think they'd be doing the world a favor. That if we could swap out some of the more expensive debt, some of the more expensive, sovereign debt from China, but also the bigger problem, which is the more expensive debt from the private sector with IBRD loans, I think that'd be a good thing. Now, in a way, that's what the IMF is meant to be up to, but nobody wants to go to the IMF. And in some ways, the World Bank is increasingly the cuddly IMF, which may sound strange to those of us who used to protest the World Bank in the 80s. But anyway, that it's an easier interlocutor than the IMF. And I would like to see some of that happening to help with the debt situation. And going forward, again, if Ghana, bad example, doesn't borrow from the IDA anymore, but if Kenya, which I think still does get access to IDA, has a choice between engaging the private sector in building a solar power plant at, and that involves debt that's at 12%, and somehow Kenyans paying the price of a 12% cost project, if you will, in their electricity. If instead it could borrow from the IBRD, provide that same electricity at the cost of sort of 4 or 5%, Kenya would get cheaper electricity. It would all be more sustainable. Would be doing. I think we ought to be looking at that model to the extent we can, without getting into a big debt crisis, and that's always the trick. I don't know if that answers that. Sorry, there was a second part to your question, which sorry.
So my second part was how to show the link that climate finance is actually still development finance, because the costs of a climate shock derail development in terms of the cost.
Yeah. So to some extent, and I'm cheating here, but to some extent, I think of adaptation finance as basically being good development finance, right? So to some extent, if the risk of a catastrophic flood has increased, when you are planning for your flood defenses, or indeed where you're going to build your new road or whatever, you should be taking that into account. And it may well mean that the thing you're about to build costs more. And that's sort of that marginal bit, I guess, is adaptation, right? But you should be doing it anyway, whether you call it adaptation finance or not, right? It's the sensible thing to do. And so I do think that, again, because low-income countries aren't responsible for the climate crisis at all, and are suffering the most in bearing some of these costs the most, this is a reason why they really deserve a lot of adaptation finance. But for me, if that's ODA, I mean, if that's development, if it's called development finance, I'm fine with that. It seems to be a kind of almost a moot point. And I had hoped, and I think the new and additional language was meant to be about sort of climate change creating a global environment where there were larger flows of resources, and that hasn't worked out. So I'm sort of less concerned about the framing than I might be, and more concerned about the outcome, which is it should be development finance that takes the fact that climate change is happening into account. Does that answer?
Thank you. I actually work for an international NGO based in Oxford, and I just have the opportunity to come and hear talks like this. My question is, when speaking to people in the FCDO, I mean, there's such fatalism, it seems, around how much of a drop in the ocean ODA is, even if it was still at 0.7%, like the trillions are needed. So it has to be, again, about leverage and bringing in the private sector. And that's obviously now even turbocharged this idea that, well, we've just got to leverage in the private money all the time. So I'd just love to hear any thoughts you may have on what is the political pathway to that, ideal ring fence of grant finance for adaptation in low-income countries, and how do we get that part of the story in there?
So I'd say two things. One, it's not a drop in the ocean when it comes to development in the poorest countries. It really actually matters. It is macroeconomically significant. We know it's saving lives, and we know it causes economic growth. Sorry, I should not be. This is an academic audience. We think it saves lives, and we think it causes economic growth, but think it really strongly. So that. But secondly, let me rephrase the way I describe multilateral development banks. They are a fantastic tool to leverage the private sector, because what in fact they do is they sit on a little bit of equity from the world's governments, and they go out into the markets and they borrow billions from the markets, from BlackRock, from whoever else, and then they lend that money on to developing countries. It is private sector mobilization at scale. It is a far more successful model than the bespoke project end stuff that we've been, that we usually think of when we think of private sector mobilization. So yes, go out and mobilize the private sector through multilateral development banks. But we should, sorry, yeah, you were telling me that, quite rightly. Last question, if that's.
Okay, thank you. Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm a Master's of Science student here studying environmental governance, and I'm also working at the Stockholm Environmental Institute. And I was wondering, I've come across a few articles lately, like saying very interesting things like investors complain that there is nowhere to put their money when the UN says that we need an extra like $4 trillion dollars a year to hit the SDGs, but there aren't many oven-ready projects. So I was wondering your thought on this. Like, is this real issue of a lack of private finance flowing, or a lack of viable investable projects, or a bit of both, maybe?
I mean, yes, it's a. There's something to that. If BlackRock thought that it could make a lot of, I'm picking on BlackRock, please. It just, if a private investor, if private investors thought there were lots of good deals in developing countries, they would be investing in them. So clearly the problem is they don't think there are a lot of good deals in developing countries. This is the problem that, you remember that slide I had with 58 different logos on it from various donor-funded efforts to get more money into the private sector. A lot of them were focused on precisely that problem. And I think what you come back with is, well, no, it's just really hard in a low-income country, or especially a poorer developing country, to find a deal that is sort of both affordable for the customers in the low-income country because they're poor, but is also going to make really quite high returns that are required by the private sector because they're taking a big risk investing in a small poor country, and that fundamental thing can't be fixed. Lawyers might help a bit, a few more engineers might help a bit, some more creative financial accounting might help a bit, and we've tried all of that. Turns out it doesn't help much, and you're still just left with this fundamental problem. And the only real way to deal with that fundamental problem is to chuck a lot of subsidies at it. But again, then we're back to, you've just eaten up all of global finance, the end. And probably not done enough to really tip the scales on mitigation. So I think there's just this sort of fundamental issue here that can't really be fixed by another project preparation facility. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for some very interesting questions, some of which I couldn't answer, and onward. Thank you.